Last week when we were working together, we were working on the ASP.NET sample apps, and we got to this point in the book where we were working on uh, the database section, basically. And, this is one of those things where you have to read really carefully, and, here I am in the aftermath, reading more carefully than I was on the fly about the connection string and how you put a connection string into your database. The one thing that we've learned already from our previous attempts at doing this stuff is that if you don't create a database, what Visual Studio does is it goes ahead and creates it for you. And one of the reasons we were getting an error at the end of the class is we went ahead and added this connection string and then figured out in the aftermath that we were getting a SQL error. So if you were watching the previous video, which was part 6A, you would have saw that error right at the end. But what I am seeing now, right here, it says you don't actually need to add the connection string. So what I'm going to begin by doing is I'm going to open up my project, I'm going to go in, I'm going to remove that connection string, and then proceed with the instructions. So that's what I'm about to do here. So I'm going back to Visual Studio here, and I'm going to open the one I was working on, which is entitled just like this. This is the last thing I did in this piece of software, so it's right there. If not, you'll need to go locate your solution file and obviously open it up in the appropriate way. I am going to go to the web config file here, and I am going to remove this section here on connection strings, just as I was mentioning just a few moments ago. So I'm deleting that little piece and saving it. From there, I'm going to go back to my employee controller file, which I still happen to have open. And then as we move on to page 120, they wanted us to make sure that we create a private class, which we did last time. That was one of the things we did actually accomplish. And I'm just reviewing it now to make sure that the code is correct. So I'm comparing now to the code that's on page 120. And I'm looking namely at this little piece here. And then also checking all the other methods that I have available. And what you guys, of course, aren't seeing is that on my second screen here, I'm looking at the correct code that I'm supposed to have and then comparing it side by side with the stuff that I should have. And I'm just trying to be really careful here. So for example, right now I'm on the edit action result method. And I'm just trying to be really careful because, of course, there's two different ones. And then in the post, that stuff all looks okay to me. And it looks like my code is all right. So now at this point, we're going to go ahead and run this. Now, hopefully, because I removed that connection string now, we should be able to launch this no problem. And then remember what happens in the background is Visual Studio will actually build out the database for us since there is no connection string. If you did have the connection string, that implies that you are connecting to a database that's already in existence. And please remember that real applications typically are driven by real databases. Now, when we run this, you'll see, just as you do at the top of page 122, that this is what we're supposed to have because there is no data to view. We just created this. We created a structure. We didn't actually populate it with data like in some of the previous examples that we were working on. So I think that's a pretty important consideration here. Now, our instructions at this point ask us to actually start looking at the SQL Server Object Explorer that's built into Visual Studio to take a look at the database that was created. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to stop the application from running. That helps. And if you guys have noticed this with Visual Studio 2017, they do a pretty good job of actually putting all these other explorers, the Server Explorer, the SQL Explorer, all right inside this little Solution Explorer area. You can also get these things to pop up on your screen by just coming up here and finding the appropriate tool. And in fact, in the book, or tutorial document, if you want to call it that, that's how they get to it, is they bring it up that way and they bring it up in a sidebar. And however you get there, that's, basically it's pretty irrelevant. But what we are looking to do here is find the database that we're working with and then pull it up. Now, if you look at the way that they break this down in the book, and I just want to bring that on screen so you guys can see that and have like some sort of a basis of comparison, really. And you notice what they're looking at here, right in this area, and maybe I should make that a little bigger. I don't know if that'll make it necessarily clearer. But you can see that inside their SQL Server, they have a bunch of different local databases. And really the key here is to find the database that matches our application. So we're looking for one that's called MVC Simple App, and then there will be models, and then the employee DB context, which is the little private component that we just added to our code. So that's what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually expand these databases here and see what I can bring up and see if we're even finding the right one. And I can see right now that this isn't the right one. This is the music store. Another local database that we're pulling up. All right, and I'm not seeing anything inside of here. So it kind of narrows it down to it has to be this one that's left. And you might have a whole bunch of listings here. And what you have to keep in mind here is that these databases are databases that kind of are generated automatically in the background. So if you've done a lot of different web projects, you've done a lot of .NET database things, you might have a bunch of listings here, or you might have nothing listed here. If you ran the code just the way that we did in part A, did the little fix that I talked about with the connection string just now, and ran it, and it launched successfully, you should have this up here. So what we're looking for is this one in particular. And then as you go in here, notice that you can start to actually break this apart and start to look at the actual tables that have been created. Now, of course, the one that is relevant to us, of course, is the employees table. That's the one that we've been working with. And of course, you can go into the Object Explorer here and really kind of break it down little by little and get into all the different things. The ones that, the pieces of information here that are really important for us really is the fact that the MVC Simple App Models EmpDB context has been created, and that there is a table inside there called employees, and it has the columns of name, joining date, and age, because those are really the key pieces of information we're wrestling with. And then kind of as, a side thing, it generates all these other things here that you may or may not use in your database work, but now we can see that those are actually present. Okay, let's jump back over to the document now and continue with our work. And I'm going to pull this back off to the side screen here to do the rest of it. And we are now moving on. Well, we were just looking at page 122. And, all right, so I'm trying to follow the little examples that he has. But what he's trying to show us here is that if you want to actually look at the data that's in this table, the one thing that you can do is come up to the table itself here in the SQL Server Object Explorer and right-click. And there is actually an option here to view the data. So if you want, you can click that, and sure enough, it will show you that there's nothing in there, right? Additionally, if you wanted, you could view the designer. And if you look at the designer, what that does. And part of, really what's happening here is the fact that you have access to all of these different capabilities. And it's all right within Visual Studio. There's no need to go to a separate database product to interact with your database. In fact, what some people might already know is that when you were learning your database stuff and you guys were learning SQL Server, that the interface that you use for the SQL Server Management Studio is actually just a modified version of Visual Studio. So the front end for that database product is Visual Studio because it basically is a coding environment, just a matter of how you deploy it and utilize it relative to your product. If you go ahead and you double click on the table itself, you're also going to notice kind of something neat, and it will smack a little bit once again of SQL Server Management Studio, is that you can go into this design mode here where it shows you, the column names, where the primary key is, whether null is allowed. And it also will give you, and notice real carefully here, it's not just SQL, but it's T-SQL, which is the Microsoft version, very close to the universal version, which shows you actually the actual SQL statement that's used to actually generate this table. So like if you wanted to write the table as a SQL statement, well, here's your code, and it's doing that work for you. So I think that's kind of a neat little feature. And then once again, if you want to look at that data, you just do the right click and do the view data, and it will actually show you. So what the author is really trying to get us to do here is to show that now that we have, this database, now we have this capability of actually starting to add stuff to it. Now, ideally, let's say we want to add that through the front end of the website, right? We want to be able to do it through the browser. But sometimes as you're doing work and building, you're going to find that as a coder, it's helpful, like let's say before you build the interface to allow people to add the data from the browser, that you actually have some data in the database so you can at least see if it's like coming up on screen correctly, if you see where I'm going with it. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to actually come into this table, and I'm just going to click right into it, and I'm going to just start typing, for example, my name, and then the joining date. And I suppose I should, let's come up with a date here. What is today? The day after the 4th of July. And then an age. And of course, I'm going to put in my real age here, which is 21. Right, that's a joke. I get it. And then you can add some additional names, kind of like what they show in the book. And then notice that, as you're typing, in the ID field, I'm not typing anything because that auto increments all by itself. So I go to the second field and I type in, a name like, whatever the name is. It doesn't really matter. And then notice the little red mark right there. And what that indicates to you is that this, even though you typed it in here, this is not yet saved. And if you notice right here in the left-hand column of the database, and it's a little hard to see, there's a little pencil, which means that the record is currently open and active, but not yet committed to the database. So the point at which it actually gets committed to the database is once I leave this particular row of the table, press enter or hit the tab key, then the red marks go away and the pencil goes away, and now that is written to the database. Okay, so I got 3 things put into the database at this point, which is what the book is asking us to do, basically to put something in. Now, I did the mistake, and real frankly, I turned the application off, okay? Now, we'll see how that reacts with the database because I have my suspicions that it might mess us up a little bit, but you're going to notice that it actually didn't. The database persisted. It pulled it up automatically. It saw that I put data in there, and it pulled that data back and put it up onto the screen. So that's actually a very powerful thing that we just did without doing a lot of work. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is let's go ahead and actually click the Create New link. So this is kind of familiar territory too. And let's put some stuff in here. I'm just grabbing the stuff that's automatically popping up. And of course, we'll type in some stuff and then we'll hit create. And then you're going to see very elegantly and cleanly added this in. And then of course, if we were back in Visual Studio looking, you should be able to see that data there as well by exploring the database tools. All right. So now the book, just to show you, it wants you to come back here into the thing, even with the product running, and go ahead and hit the refresh key on the database, and you will see that the entry that I added from the front end, from the web, is writing indeed to the database, and it is being picked up by Visual Studio. So verify that. If you've succeeded in doing that, I want you to actually continue to maybe experiment a little bit. But really, you've already completed section 15. So that, we weren't really all that far from completing it last time. It's just that we just, plain and simple, ran out of time and didn't read that one line that kind of threw us off a little bit. So this completes section 15 on databases. And from here, we're going to move on to section 16.